Okay, hello everybody. Welcome, week 6, and let us start with chapter 7. Very good. And let me just call up my screen. Okay, and chapter 7, we will be talking about memory. Okay, what characterizes memory, how memory works, um, how it doesn't work, how we forget, what memory construction is, and we'll go through a few, I think, kind of interesting examples which kind of flesh out how our memory functions. A big area in the area of psychology. Interesting enough, probably the one we're going to be talking about a number of cognitive functions in that are focus of attention, focus of interest in psychology, including things like attention and concentration. But memory is one of those areas that is probably the most referred problem to psychologists to assess. Yeah, more so than other things such as problems with attention or concentration or organization or planning. Memory seems to be the one thing that really catches people's attention if they're having problems with it and they want help with it. Okay, so with that, let's move on. Let's continue with an example. Now, I'd like to present kind of a forensic example here, something from a legal case, a criminal case. Okay, and I'm going to be reading the facts of this case, and my apologies if it seems a little pedantic with my reading off the facts of this case, but I just really want to be sure that I'm covering the the essential facts here. Okay, so on a cold night in November, police officer Robert Wood and his partner spotted a car driving with its headlights off. Wood signaled the car to pull over and get out, and got out of his car, and walked up to the driver's side. Very typical situation for a police officer. Very often, kind of a scary thing for a police officer, because they never know when they might run into this kind of situation. He intended only to tell the driver to turn on his lights, but he never got the chance. Before Wood could even speak, the driver pointed a handgun at Wood and shot him, killing him instantly. Wood's partner emptied her revolver at the car as it sped away, but the killer escaped. Okay. A month later, the police picked up a suspect, 16-year-old David Harris. Harris admitted that he had stolen a neighbor's car and revolver the day before the murder, that this was the car that Wood had pulled over, and that he was in the car when the murder occurred. Harris denied, however, that he was the one who shot Wood. He said that he had picked up a hitchhiker, and the hitchhiker, Randall Adams, had and that he had let Adams drive. It was Adams, he claimed, who reached under the seat, grabbed the revolver, and shot the officer. Okay. When the police called in and questioned Randall Adams, he admitted he had gotten a ride from David Harris, but said Harris had dropped him off at a motel 3 hours before the murder occurred. It was Harris, he claimed, who was the murderer. So who was telling the truth? It was Harris's word against Adams, until the police found 3 eyewitnesses who corroborated Harris's story. Emily and Robert Miller testified that they drove by just before Officer Wood was shot. Though it was dark, they said they got a good look at the driver of the car and both identified him as Randall Adams. When he wrote, quote, "When he rolled down the window, that's what made his face stand out," said Robert Miller. Quote, "He had a beard, mustache, kind of dishwater blonde hair," close quotes. David Harris was clean shaven, and at the time of the murder, Randall Adams did indeed fit Miller's description, as seen in the photo you'll see in a moment. Michael Randall, a salesman, also happened to be driving by right before the murder and claimed to have seen 2 people in the car. He said the driver had long hair and a mustache. Okay, so who do you think committed the murder? The real jury believed the eyewitnesses and convicted Adams, sentencing him to death. However, as Adams languished in jail, waiting for the courts to hear his appeals, several experts began to doubt he was guilty. Should be newer, not never. Newer evidence came to light largely because of the film made about the case, The Thin Blue Line, and it's now almost certain that Harris was the murderer. Harris was later convicted on another murder, and while on death row, strongly implied that he, not Randall Adams, had shot Officer Wood. An appeals court finally overturned Adams' conviction. He was a free man after spending 12 years in prison for a crime he never committed. All righty, based on the testimony of 3 eyewitnesses. So let's look at pictures of Randall Adams and Harris. Okay. So on the left is Randall Adams, and on the right is Harris. Wow, they look like twins. Of course, they don't look like twins. They look completely different. But how was it that the eyewitnesses pointed out Adams on the left, but not Harris on the right? Yeah, because they're so strikingly different. What made them presume or assume or reconstruct in their memory that it was Adams on the left that had committed the crime, right? They even saw facial hair and so on. Well, that's what we'll talk about. And when we meet face to face, we'll talk about through this chapter. But when we meet face to face, I'd like to kind of touch on this case and get your thoughts about how this really horrible mistake was made by 3 eyewitnesses, and that Adams' conviction, right, which put him in jail, in prison for about 12 years, ultimately turned on eyewitness testimony. All righty. Well, we'll talk about some of those issues when we meet face to face. I'd like some of your thoughts about that. Now, first of all, when we talk about memory, what is memory? Okay. Well, it's the ability to store and retrieve information. Kind of like your computer, right? Its ability to store all your files and your ability to retrieve those files or programs. Okay. Now, to remember an event usually involves a few processes, key processes. One is to encode that information in some manner. Yeah, encode it so that you can find it later. Okay? The next step is to store that memory. All righty. And finally, it's to retrieve it. Right. So, like putting a encoding on a book, right? Like the letter number sequence on the binding of a library book, placing that book into its appropriate area in the library, and then also being able to find that book later. Okay, that's how a library generally works. That's how our memory generally works. Okay, and computers as well. All righty, but let's flesh this out a little further. Let's first talk about encoding. Okay, so how do we encode our memories? Yeah, well, we certainly don't put, a letter number sequence on each of our experiences, right? What we learned in chem, a conversation we had, a traffic incident we had. We don't take all those memories and put letters and numbers on them, right? But we do process that information. And there are different ways we process that information. One is by automatic processing. Yeah, and one of the areas in which we automatically process is space-time and occurrence of events. Yeah, so spatial kinds of experiences like walking to class, when it occurs. Yeah, and we also do it, and also how often we automatically process information, all factors into how a certain memory is encoded. So location, yeah, when something occurs and its duration, and also the number of times we have an experience, all go to automatic processing. Yeah, one of the classic examples you might think of is when you find your classroom for the first time. Yeah, someone might direct you because you don't know where the classroom is. You might need to use a map or find it on your phone, right, through an app, and then you walk to your classroom. And in most cases, when you've done that once, that's sufficient. Yeah, you don't have to use your app again or use a map again for the most part, right? And why is that? Well, one of the things we've come to discover is when it comes to visual spatial information, that's one of the things we often do quite automatically, quite naturally. And it's an ability which probably evolved in our species and was adaptive for our species. Yeah, our ability to organize and process spatial information. Yeah. Probably for hunter-gatherers, it was really critical that those amongst us who could process that information very quickly would survive, right? When moseying around some kind of a strange terrain. Alrighty. Effortful processing refers to that kind of processing of information in which we got to attend to something and put conscious effort. Right? So automatic processing, as I mentioned to you, like finding your classroom for the first time, yeah, your processing for memory purposes is kind of automatic, right? Maybe the thing that takes effort is using the map or following someone's directions, but in terms of trying to remember it, right, it's fairly automatic. You're walking and you're taking in that information, and odds are you don't have to be shown how to get there again, right? Depending on, you know, how, the distance from which you're coming from, but even that, for the most part, right? You usually aren't coming from out of state to go back to your class the next day, right? Now, effortful processing, unlike automatic processing, as the term suggests, takes effort. You got to, you know, put in time and concentrate, right? It takes cognitive effort, right? Which, you know, takes, you know, energy, physical energy, right? You can almost feel it when you've been like trying to learn a bunch of new vocabulary words or new words to a language like Spanish or Chinese, right? That you got to concentrate, you got to think about it, and that takes cognitive effort. Alrighty, effort which we have, and we have usually have more resources, more cognitive resources to put into cognitive effort earlier in the day or at certain times of the day, certainly when we're better rested and so on, versus later in the day, or we haven't had an opportunity, or if we don't have a lot of sleep, right? It's much harder to, it's much more difficult to put in that cognitive effort. So effortful processing requires conscious effort, requires attention, yeah? And we retain information often by doing things such as rehearsing or repetition. Yeah. So if you're rehearsing a musical scale, new vocabulary, right, calculus, physics formula, right, by rehearsing or repeating those particular bits of information. Yeah. And sometimes we do it by not just rehearsing or repetition, but applying that information to something that often helps us encode the information. Yeah, when we can apply a mathematical formula to a specific problem, that makes that formula more likely to stick in our memory. Yeah. Spacing also has an effect on our effortful processing. Yeah, so that's why you hear that old maxim about spacing out your learning as opposed of some material for a test as opposed to cramming it the night before. Yeah, because that's absolutely true. That's how our brain works. In other words, if you have to spend, let's say, 4 hours in reviewing for your history exam, alrighty, you're far more likely to retain the information if you take that 4 hours and spend 1 hour each day, yeah, across the week, yeah, as opposed to studying it 4 hours the night before. Yeah. Why is that? Yeah. Well, we're not exactly sure, but it's psychology and science is not exactly certain. But one of the things that the research seems to indicate is that it has something to do with rehearsing the information, practicing the information, going over the information, even when we don't intend to. Yeah, like in our sleep. Yeah, there seems to be some evidence that we may rehearse or reprocess memory information in our sleep. And particularly when we get a lot of rest or whatever that may be for each of us, yeah, that's particularly important for the brain to have a certain amount of sleep for encoding information, yeah, putting that little tagger on it so that we can retrieve it later. This is an example of a way you can kind of test for visual information. You can show the visual stimuli here briefly and then ask people afterwards how much they remember. Yeah, and there's a lot of these details that you remember kind of automatically, and some you might put a little bit of effort depending on the information. Okay, so what is encoded? Well, these are some of the things which we kind of put tags to. Yeah, certainly things which have meaning. Yeah, and one of the things that are particularly which are easier for us to process and code are things that have a meaning to us personally. Yeah, self-referential information. Yeah, things we can associate with ourselves, our culture, our past learning experiences. Yeah. So anything which has meaning, right, that we can connect in a meaningful way or meaningful pattern with knowledge we've already acquired or that's particularly personally relevant to us. We can also process visual information, yeah, as we just mentioned, showed earlier with the concrete picture, right? And concrete pictures, we tend to do far concrete stimuli or better able to process than abstract information, yeah? So if you see something of this sort, yeah, it's easier. We can do it far more easily, quickly, yeah, more effortlessly than say an abstract discussion about justice or existence or logical reasoning behind a certain problem or and so on. Yeah, so concrete things which you can perceive according to certain physical characteristics, yeah, are easier for us to process than abstract things. Yeah, construct phenomena not dependent on their physical features for us to understand, or they have no physical features for us to understand, like justice and existence. Now we can also process information. One memory strategy is the method of loci, which you may have learned in previous classes or experiences, yeah, which is a way of memorizing things by associating different points of information with an area or space that we're familiar with. Yeah, it could be our home, could be our neighborhood, could be a dorm room, or what have you, ATM, right? Because those things we have in our memory kind of firmly rooted. We can visually picture our dorm room, visually picture maybe a path from our home to the local 7-Eleven and all the things between our home and the 7-Eleven effortlessly, right? You can picture that. That if you associate things which are harder to remember, which take more effort to remember, like parts of a speech, say you have 7 parts of a speech, and if you take each speech idea and you associate it with a part of your home that you can visualize, like the mailbox, then a red car that's always parked, 2 driveways away, then a stoplight, and so on, bus stop, right? You associate the ideas with these concrete images that you can remember the 7 points of your speech by the method of loci, the location of the ideas with that visual image. Another way we encode things is we like to organize. We like to, first of all, we're pattern seekers. We love to see patterns even when they don't exist. Yeah, that's certainly adaptive for us in many ways. In the evolution of our species, it was adaptive to see patterns. And that can work against us. Sometimes we see patterns when patterns don't even exist. We're such pattern seekers, as we had discussed in our chapter on sensation and perception. Yeah, but that's one of the ways we can remember information. One way is by chunking things into meaningful units. Yeah, like for example, phone numbers, right? Phone numbers are typically 10-digit points of information, which can be really kind of hard as a general matter to memorize, right? Unless you chunk it. And one of the ways you can chunk it is, first of all, come up with the area code. Yeah, so for Hawaii, it's 808. For New York, Manhattan, it's 212, or Queens and Brooklyn, I think, are 718, and so on. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of stuck with me from the time I was in New York. And then you can break down the phone number, the 7 remaining digits even further, right? The first 3 digits may suggest a certain area. Like here in Hawaii, I think for Waterfront Plaza and ATM, it tends to be 522. Yeah, and then you just associate 522 with a lot of HPU kind of numbers. And then it's just the last 4 digits you have to probably remember. Okay, other ways we organize information is by establishing hierarchies. Okay, besides patterns, right? That's a type of pattern we like to see, right? What's on top, what's in the middle, what we break down into subparts, and so on. Yeah. When you think about employment chart, right? President, vice president, managers, employees, different departments, right? A university, right? You have the president, you have administration, right? Provosts, vice presidents, then you have colleges and deans and departments, right? That's one way you can remember very complex kind of a structure or system. Yeah. And we are inclined to think that way because one, those patterns exist, but also we set things up to have structure and hierarchy. Um, we and because so much of life is a function of systems, things affecting like the ecosystem. Now, the traditional model of storage, there are different models, but the one, the classic model, which still applies to many situations, is this three-stage processing model set forth by Atkinson and Shiffrin. Okay. Now, the three-stage processing model proposes that there are really three phases: a sensory, short-term, and long-term memory phases. Now, the sensory memory refers to our immediate memory. And you can think of it kind of like our digital camera on our phones or the scanner with our computers, right? That ability to just pick up information, just scan something and retain it for a moment. Alrighty. The next is short-term memory, or what's often referred to as working memory. Yeah. You can kind of think of this as our equivalent to RAM on our computers, right? And what does RAM do? RAM, random access memory, is typically that memory in the computer which manages different programs, right? Kind of figures what program will interact with what other program. That's kind of like what short-term memory is. For us, it's about a 15, 30-second kind of lifespan of memory, which allows us to kind of juggle information to determine, work with it, working memory, to determine how we're going to encode it or whether we're going to encode it. Yeah. For example, you hear someone's phone number, right? You process it and you start putting it into long-term memory when you think about the person, the area code, where they're from, if they're from New York or Hawaii, what part of Hawaii, and maybe just the last 4 digits. You try to think of some way to you associate those 4 digits with the person. Okay. Now, in general, the working kind of table, so to speak, of memory, short-term memory, usually has a capacity of about 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. Yeah? So about 5 to 9 bits of information we can process and kind of keep in our head with some effort, and then we can hold it, with little to no effort for about 15 to 30 seconds. Yeah. If you want to retain it for a longer period of time, then we got to start thinking about it, talking about it, and start processing it. All righty. And ultimately, what we are kind of making a determination is what will go into long-term memory or not. Now, long-term memory, which we have for things such as vocabulary, right? Certain well-learned subject matter, that is useful to us, is immense, and it's really hard to determine what the size of human long-term memory really is. I mean, we can make some estimates, and maybe a very rough estimate is if you were to imagine a room, really bad with square feet, but let's just say a room that has a length, right? You enter the door and then it's about, let's say the room is about 30 feet deep and then another 30 feet wide. And then again, to your left is a bookshelf that rises about 10 feet high. And then across from you against the wall is another bookshelf that goes for left to right 30 feet and then goes upwards of 10 feet. And if you imagine all those bookshelves being filled with books, that's on average what the capacity of human long-term memory may be. Yeah, it's hard to say. Certainly less for some people, about that size, maybe even more for some people. It is hard to really establish what is the ceiling with that. Yeah, but it's pretty immense. Now, there are 2 subcategories of memory when we're thinking about long-term memory. One is declarative memory. The other is non-declarative. Now, explicit or declarative memory includes things such as definitions, concepts, facts and figures, and so on. Yeah, they seem to be processed in the medial temporal lobe and then become stored in the neocortex and the hippocampus. Hippocampus is also involved in encoding that memory and storing it to relevant parts of the neocortex. Okay. Now there are some subparts to that. One is semantic memory. Okay, that kind of rote memory for, like, let's say a vocabulary in Spanish, or something like that, or what capital, the capital of every state. Okay. First is episodic memory. Okay, so an episodic memory is a memory for you know, let's just say you're coming up with a mnemonic to understand, remember all the names of the bones in the hand, right? There's a certain medical school mnemonic to remember all the bones in the hand. And as you may recall, right, mnemonic is a memory device, right? So you might think of a word like twilight, and each letter of the word twilight, Twilight, is the first letter of an idea, right? So it can help you remember what's twilight, 8 letters, right? So the 8 words. First word starts with T, next one W, and so on. Okay, that's episodic memory. Now, implicit memory or non-declarative memory, it refers to those things which are related to performance, like driving or riding a bike or playing the piano. Yeah, it's often associated with a motoric behavior. Yeah, so like piano or playing a guitar, musical instrument is a classic example of implicit non-declarative memory. Okay, it's often referred to as procedural memory. Yeah, and priming is often involved in getting access to these memories. We'll talk about priming in a moment. Right now, the part of the brain that seems to be particularly involved in the processing of implicit non-declarative memory is the cerebellum. You may recall our prior discussion in our um, brief review or discussion of neuroanatomy, right? The cerebellum is kind of at the back, lower part of the brain, originally thought of as primarily involved in motoric functions, but it's also involved in memory, as you may recall, and in particular, implicit kind of performance memory. This is just a little schematic, do I dare say hierarchy, of how memory works. Okay, so how do we store memories? Okay, well, as I mentioned before, long-term memory is almost limitless. I mean, there are certain limits, but as described with that kind of visual room example, pretty huge. But human memory is kind of weird, is that we're kind of this duality. In one sense, our memories are really immense. Long-term memories can be extremely expansive, right? But forgetting occurs almost the moment we start, try to attempt to process information, or we hear or experience something. Right? So imagine having a conversation with someone, and then you go into your classroom, you're in the class for 75 minutes, you come out, and someone reminds you of that conversation. Now, you might remember having that conversation, but you probably don't remember the conversation word for word. You might even have a hard time remembering some of the main things that were discussed in that conversation. Yeah, and certainly an hour later, a half day later, a few days later, right? There's less and less to remember. Now, that might seem like a darn shame, right? Why don't we have memories like hard drives, like computers? Yeah, maybe that would be kind of nifty in some respects, being able to remember things with such detail. But there may be actually a reason why our brain operates that way. Yeah, and it probably has to do with editing, yeah? Allowing our brain the capacity to keep the stuff we need to know, yeah, but editing stuff out that we don't need to, or we probably don't need to remember. That's probably part of it. Yeah, it may also have to do with creative, imaginative abilities. Yeah, leaving cognitive resources for those tasks as opposed to just memorizing things. Okay. Now, when we learn something, be it a language, a musical instrument, a path to take, right? What we're developing are connections between tens and thousands, if not millions of neurons, right? Depending on the memory. And we establish those connections via the synapses, right? So the space between a neuron and then the adjoining dendrite or the adjoining neuron and its cell body, right? And synapses, those spaces, right? We establish greater connections between those spaces, right? Which allows an impulse to travel quicker, more efficiently. Yeah? So the more we repeat, let's say, a vocabulary word, right, and try to memorize it, we establish that synapse. And you can actually see that in the brains of different people with different abilities. Yeah, musicians tend to have certain connections. Different types of musicians have certain types of connections, right, in their brain. People who are into literature and writing and poetry will have different connections. Yeah, so all of us have different brain patterns as a function of what we remember or what we've practiced and rehearsed. Yeah, that will have different synaptic connections. Yeah. So in other words, whenever you learn something, right, you're making a choice about how to construct your brain. Yeah? And the highways and byways of all those billions, literally billions of neurons. Yeah. All right. So what facilitates that? Kind of touched on this a moment ago, the transfer of short to long-term memory, certainly practice, right? Rehearsal, the time between learning sessions. Yeah, is so trying to cram in learning a song on the piano 4 hours before recital, not so great, but you're probably better off if you spaced out that learning or practiced an hour. Um, I don't know if it's a whole song, but at least parts of that song, you know it better that same 4 hours if you space it out, yeah, across a few or several days. Now, another thing that seems really critical for memory, and we're not exactly sure why, but sleep. Yeah. Now, for every individual, that's going to vary. Alrighty. On average, in the population, it's 7. For some, it's much less. For some, much more. You know, I had an uncle who, well into being middle-aged and older, into his 50s and 60s, would tell people he was absolutely fine with 3 hours of sleep. And some people are that way. Other people require maybe 8 or 9 hours. So there's variation, alrighty. But once you find whatever that ideal amount of sleep is for you, that really is critical for memory consolidation. Yeah. And the research does seem to know that the brain seems to work at reinforcing those synaptic connections, yeah, or even rehearsing it in some way. Yeah. Some people may actually recall what dreams very often, this function that dreams may serve, one of the functions dreams may serve is actually rehearsal, having us kind of go over the events of the previous day or a previous moment or experience. Now, other things that can affect memory consolidation is certainly stress. Yeah, but it kind of depends. Yeah, a certain amount of stress, right, is actually helpful. Kind of motivates us and can kind of energize our cognitive resources to focus, to attend, to concentrate, to rehearse, right, to try to find meaning in events so that they are meaningful. They're meaningful to some kind of a personal experience we've had or something we've learned before, if not a personal experience. Okay, but if we're in a circumstance where things are too stressful, and again, it'll depend on the individual, right? Maybe the extreme example could be like having to live in a war-torn country, right? You're not going to learn very well, right? Children in a school setting, when they're hearing explosions going off in the background, are not going to learn things very well because they are stressing out, right? They're probably suffering from PTSD. Right? You might remember some things. You might remember the traumatic event real well, but you're not going to be learning a new language very well if you're in a war-torn country. Okay, because too much production of stress hormones will not facilitate memory consolidation. Yeah, but again, in traumatic situations, when you're that stressed out, probably for the traumatic event. Okay, when we meet, we're going to go over what this is a test of memory from the IQ test, actually an older version of the IQ test, okay? And it's called digit span. And we will go over this. Well, I'm just going to kind of bypass this for now, but we'll go over this when we meet face to face. All righty. With that, let me get okay, let me just pause things for a moment here and get out of this and pause here. Okay, thank you again for your patience. Let me call up my screen. And bring this forward. All righty. So continuing our discussion, when retrieving memories, there are cues that we utilize. Yeah, cues that we use in the environment. In the environment being very broadly, right? Maybe particular circumstances, stuff from, let's say, our notes. We use memory things we can remember to cue us into other information. Yeah. Now, what are some of the things, just generally speaking, aside from being examined on something, just in terms of accessing memories as a general matter, context can affect remembering things. Yeah. As a general matter, it's probably better for you to take a exam for a class in the same classroom that you got the lectures. Yeah, because that context being in the same classroom will actually make it a little easier to remember things that the professor said about the topic. Yeah. Same thing relates to crime scenes. Yeah. There's no small reason why eyewitnesses are brought back to the scene of the crime. Yeah. Part of it is that when they're in the apartment on the street corner, the particular cues, right, the stoplight, the furniture in the home can help them access memories easier as a general matter. Mood can also affect our ability to retrieve information. Yeah. So if we're in the same emotional state that we were when we first acquired information, we're more likely to remember it. Yeah. And this is referred to as state-dependent memory. Yeah. What state or condition we were in. Okay. Not one of the 50 states, one of the physical or emotional states we were in. Yeah. So, for example, if you're in a really good mood, you're at a party, having a great time, and suddenly suddenly someone brings up an argument you had with your family member or loved one, right? You may not remember all the stuff that was said, right? But if you are later at some later point, you're in a foul mood because you got into an argument with someone, and then someone brings up the argument you had with that family member or loved one, it may be easier for you to remember the things you said or the stupid things they said because you're angry, right? Simply by virtue of your mood, you remember the stuff that got you angry, yeah, and so on. Oh, and a double whammy. If you go to the same location and you're in the same mood, right? You might remember stuff related to that situation and the mood you're in, right? That's like if you broke up with someone, right? That's usually a really horrible experience, whether you're the breaker or the breakee. Although it's probably better to be the breaker than the breakee in most cases, right? But when you break up, you're in that kind of breakup situation, you might have exchanged some words, have some conversation, but then, months later, right, you're in a good mood. It might be much harder to remember exactly what was said accurately and so on, right? As dialogue often is kind of hard to remember word for word. Some people are better at it than others. But man, if you go back to that same location, the restaurant, the apartment, and you're in that same mood, right? It's certainly just that's going to put you in the mood. And then when the sadder you get, right, or upset you get, you'll probably remember exactly what was said or what you guys were wearing and all that kind of stuff. Now, forgetting, right? The process of forgetting is something that we're still trying to understand, all righty? But it certainly can occur in a number of places along the process of trying to remember something, okay? So first of all, it could be a problem of encoding. Yeah, that maybe we didn't put the right tagger or label on the memory. So we had a hard time storing it, categorizing it, putting it in a hierarchy. Alrighty, so maybe we just didn't encode it. We didn't think about it. We didn't, and even if we thought about it, we didn't think about it in any logical way to kind of tag it, yeah, with that kind of code. There could have been, even if we did tag it, right? We kind of sorted it as conversation with ex-girlfriend, boyfriend, or Spanish vocabulary, right? Maybe there's storage decay. Right? If we don't use it, we lose it. That goes for a lot of things. I don't have to tell you that, right? Whether it's word knowledge, musical ability, right? Things fade. Yeah? Oh, but the amazing thing though, yeah, whether it's verbal information like a Spanish vocabulary word or how to play a musical scale, right? Although if you don't use it, you lose it, right? And anyone who's like play piano, right? You kind of know if you don't practice songs, you just start forgetting those songs. That said, right? If you kind of, grab the song sheets and then you start practicing again, it comes back to you, right? It's almost kind of amazing how much it was actually back there. But if you get certain cues like the song sheets, right? You can kind of remember that stuff again. Okay, so certainly starts to create just a natural, there is just a natural gradual fading of memories. And as we mentioned before, we aren't like computers. Yeah, for some people that's very sad. I sometimes think, but maybe it's a good thing, right? Maybe it allows us to forget things we don't need to remember, right? So that we don't start, just like with the computer, right? Maybe computers, right? Their memory starts becoming too full and then the programming slows down. Maybe it's good that we don't keep all that stuff stored, right? And perhaps it would make it harder to learn new things. Heck, maybe even our programming might get a little mucked up. And also, maybe it's good that we forget some things just on an emotional level too. Negative events. Yeah. And I think we do. I mean, it works both ways, right? Sometimes there's just some painful memories it's just impossible to forget. We wish we could forget. But I think we kind of, it's kind of like focusing on the bad, right? When we hear about a bad situation, we think, oh, then it's all bad, right? Um, you know, uh, we've kind of focused on dramatic instances. Well, the same thing I think with memory happens. We think, oh, I can never forget that horrible argument that we had with a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? We wish we could forget it. Yeah, because that's something that stands out. It's dramatic. But if you really were to count things, you might actually be struck or pleasantly surprised at how many crappy things you do forget. You just don't think about. And maybe that's a part of how forgetting is adaptive. Yeah, that we don't weigh ourselves down with all that kind of negative stuff too on an emotional level. Or finally, retrieval, right? We may encode, we may store it, right? But we just have a hard time retrieving it, right? We don't have the particular cue in our notes, in context, in conversation for us to access what is well stored, right? There may be things that are interfering with our ability, right? We may have, there's proactive versus retroactive interference. Yeah. Now, proactive is when something we learned first interferes with something we learned later, right? That interference may occur because they're very similar. For example, learning two languages like Spanish and French, right? Because you first learned Spanish, right? It may make it a little tricky to learn French because there's a number of commonalities in Western Romance languages, yeah? Or it can work the other way around too, right? You first learn Spanish, and as you're learning French, right? Because there's so many commonalities, you might make mistakes when you bring up a Spanish word. You might pronounce it like a French word, right? Because the later stuff is interfering with your ability to access the earlier stuff. All righty. And again, kind of along the lines of the emotional stuff, there's motivated forgetting, right? We're kind of motivated to forget some things that we'd rather not think about. And I think we kind of underestimate the human capacity to kind of forget stuff we don't want to think about. And I think people are kind of good with that too. So what is memory construction? What memory construction refers to, as the term kind of suggests, is our ability to, that a lot of our memories are not, as I mentioned before, digital photos, digital audio, I guess, podcasts of things that were said, right? We don't remember things precisely. And digital memory is pretty darn precise, right? You save a Word file. And if nothing happens to the computer, right, 10 years later, and you're able to retrieve that Word file, you'll get it 100% accurate, right? As a general matter, presuming there are no no software problems. And that's certainly not how human memory works, as with the example of a conversation with someone that you may have had just 75 minutes before. You may forget a lot of the content, of what was discussed. And that's just human memory, right? It always starts to fade. And also the other thing that occurs is that we often reshape it or reconstruct our memories, based on things that happen afterwards. Things people suggest to us about what was said or what was done or what was occurred or what we think, if not suggested by outside sources, what we just think may have occurred because of expectations, attitudes, and so on. Okay, so the misinformation effect refers to how after exposure to a subtle information, we misremember. What would be an example? Let's just say at a family gathering, your grandfather wasn't there, right? He had something to attend to, so he wasn't at the picnic. But then a couple years later, when you're talking with your cousins, they talk about, oh, how grandpa, was so funny at that picnic 2 years before. And you go, was he? And then afterwards, when you have a conversation a couple months later, right, it's in your head that grandpa was at the picnic because of misinformation, because your cousin provided that misinformation that he was there when he actually wasn't. Alrighty, misinformation can occur in all kinds of ways, right? There's an infinite number of ways, right? From someone we know, from something that was said on the news, from something we read afterwards, right? That affects our memory of the prior event. Okay, and if there are gaps in our memory, one thing we're very inclined to do is we like to fill in gaps. Right? We don't like incomplete stories, so we try to fill in those gaps. We try to find patterns, whether they exist or they don't exist. And the other thing that can affect reconstruction of memory is subsequent retelling, either by others or by ourselves. Every time we think about an event again, there's that possibility or probability that we're going to alter it slightly as a function of things that have occurred since that event. Now, a big figure in psychology from the University of Oregon, I believe, is Elizabeth Loftus. Elizabeth Loftus has done, I don't know if hundreds, but dozens of studies, really good research in this area of memory construction or reconstruction. And a lot of her research has been used in terms of illuminating the fallibility of eyewitness testimony, which is essentially an attempt to remember a past event. And what her research and also other related research has shown is that eyewitness testimony is incredibly unreliable, incredibly poor, because of a number of factors, including memory reconstruction. A very typical type of study that Loftus is an example of a study that Loftus has done, but is common of the types of studies she's done, is that she would show subjects with like one of two photos. Either the one here where there's a stop sign, and the exact same photo where there's a yield sign. And then subjects got either this or that, and similar kinds of photos. And then afterwards, right, subjects would be asked by the examiner, oh, did you see a stop sign or yield sign? Okay. Now, they would sometimes be asked about something that was in the picture. In other words, if the person saw a picture of a stop sign, they were asked, was there a stop sign? Or some subjects randomly were asked about something that wasn't in the picture. So if they saw a picture of a stop sign, they were asked about whether there was a yield sign, and then vice versa for the yield people. And what would Loftus find? She would find that typically, right, first of all, people generally had difficulty remembering exactly what they saw, right? But then that accuracy would decrease even further if the question was about an item that wasn't in the picture. In other words, if the stop sign people were asked, was there a yield sign, right, there is an increased chance that they would not remember accurately, but say, yes, there was a yield sign. All righty. And what source amnesia refers to is our forgetting what may have been the source of our misremembering things. So like in that instance, subjects would swear, right? Most subjects, not all, but most subjects would swear that there was a yield sign, even though what they were actually shown was a stop sign. And what they had amnesia for was what actually caused that disruption in their memory, which was how the experimenter, right, chose to ask about that, what they saw. Yeah, if they used the word yield when the subject actually saw a stop sign. Yeah. So this has huge implications when it comes not only to memory and how memory works, right, the reconstructive characteristic of memory, but also has huge implications in the legal realm, yeah, in terms of how people are asked about what they experienced. So in either civil or criminal litigation, how police officers ask, how friends and family members ask us about our experiences, how prosecutors do, or even judges in some instances, and how that can all affect our actual of what we actually our memory of what we actually experienced. Yeah, and leading to every time we have a retelling of it, um, people suggest information to us, and so on, and we retell this information to other people. Yeah, we increase the probability that we're going to distort our memory of what we actually experienced. Okay, let me bypass some of this. Now, false confessions. Yeah, so this is certainly related to what we're talking about with memory and memory reconstruction. But here it's a different. It's not memory reconstruction. Yeah, well, it can be memory reconstruction. Yeah, but this is another issue, and the issue is whether we acknowledge wrongdoing. Okay, now is it possible for someone to confess to something they didn't do? Well, it certainly seems odd that someone would do that. It seems counterintuitive. Yeah, it doesn't make common sense, kind of like what we've spoken about in chapter 1. Common sense would suggest people never, ever admit to a wrongdoing that they didn't commit, right? If they're innocent, they'd never acknowledge having had done wrong or a particular wrongful act. Yeah, but actually research seems to suggest that it's possible. One, it indicates that it is possible, and in some instances, probable. Yeah, it's not just possible, but probable, but likely, not for everybody, but for many people in certain circumstances. Yeah. First, let's talk about the types of confessions. First, there's the voluntary false confession. Yeah, that's when someone confesses to something, but it's offered without any kind of external pressure, and no one forced them to. They phoned the police and they said, "Hey, I'm the one who committed those 17 murders in the movie theater," right? And that happens, oddly enough, for high-profile crimes. Now, why that may happen? That may happen because someone wants, someone is has some psychiatric issues and they want the attention. So they're confessing to something without any external pressure from anybody, right? And that happens with high profile cases. It can occur because someone wants to, take the hit for somebody else. Yeah. Now, is that a likely or a common event? Probably not a common event. Does it happen? Sure, it happens. Yeah, happens in families. Maybe a family member wants to take a responsibility so that a younger family member or child perhaps won't be held responsible. Certainly can happen in criminal organizations. Yeah, somebody taking the hit for somebody else. Okay, so there are certain, well, although maybe with the last example, there is some external pressure, but certainly with family and friends, right, somebody might take the hit for a loved one. Now, there are other types of confessions. There's this coerced compliant and the coerced internalized. Now, the coerced compliant occurs when someone confesses to a crime after intense external pressure. Yeah, so let's just say interrogation of a suspect for a few or several hours, right? Police officers leaning into them and so on. And the person just wants to get out of there. So they sign a confession and afterwards they say, okay, well, I'm just going to say afterwards that, I was pressured into doing that, which is not a good idea, okay? Because that is very persuasive evidence to a jury. All right, and it's very tough to convince a jury afterwards that you would, because of the common sense or intuitive notion that no one would ever do that. But do people do that? Sometimes, yeah. And there have been cases where people have been afterwards found guilty of signing a confession, particularly young people. yeah, maybe in their late adolescence, signing to something because they just wanted to get out of that negative situation, right? Being held by the police and saying afterwards, oh, I just did it so I can get out of there. But people don't believe that story. Yeah, is it possible? Sure, it's possible. And there have been cases where people have been completely exonerated, were convicted, but then later exonerated, right? Found innocent. Uh, but the people, those individuals were found initially convicted because of that coerced compliant confession. Now, there's the one that's particularly concerning and of interest for research purposes is the coerced internalized false confession. Now, that's the situation where someone may be coerced to, give a confession, right? They've been in interrogation for several hours. They feel the pressure of the police coming down on them. And then they sign a confession. But here's the interesting twist, though. They actually believe what they're confessing to, even though they didn't commit the act. Now, the question may occur, how can that happen? That seems to make no sense whatsoever. Yeah. But is it possible? Yeah, research indicates it's possible. Yeah. How probable? Even probable under some circumstances. Not, which doesn't mean it's gonna happen all the time. Yeah, but that it can, and there's an increased probability under certain circumstances. All righty. Now, psychologist who has done a lot of research in this area is Saul Kassin. Now, one study that Kassin has set up, we'll probably watch by way of video when we meet face to face, okay? But it will lay out what circumstances may lead to the coerced internalized confession. Okay, so we'll look, and then after we see that video, we'll go over Kassin and Kaicho's 1996 study. Yeah, very interesting data concerning the possibility or probability of these kinds of things occurring. Okay. And with that, I think I'll end our discussion here. And with that, that ends our discussion about Chapter 7 in memory. So otherwise, I look forward to seeing you face to face. And again, thank you for the privilege of your time and take care. Bye-bye.